Hello people, welcome to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Right, here's a video I've been looking forward to doing for some time. It's my films of the year review, looking back at my 10 favourite films and also a few stinkers and my disappointment of the year. I'll just put my glasses on better, thank you. Now, just to put this into context and into perspective, when I say they're my favourite films of the year, they're the films that I most enjoyed, that gave me the most enjoyment. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they were the best films of the year, but they're the ones that, when I went to the cinema, they gave me that experience of having a good time. I didn't come away thinking, that was a bit, no, I wasn't sure about that. It was just generally films which gave me a bit of a kick. Which is why anybody looking at this list will think, well, this bloke just likes lowest common denominator sort of action films. Where's the Oscar-winning stuff? Where's Nomadland? Where's The Father? Where's the this? Where's the that? And I must admit, I haven't seen those films. They're sort of films I'm interested in seeing, but to me, they're not films that necessarily need to be seen on the big screen because they're smaller scale dramas. There are a couple on this list that are certainly one which I watched this week, in fact, which I picked up in a sale in HMV, and I'd wanted to see for a while. And this is one which has made my top 10 list, even though it's not a big, explosive extravaganza. So the films that aren't on my list are films that sort of just made me feel excited. You know, I am a fan of science fiction and fantasy and not so much horror, but the genre storytelling is what particularly attracts me. I'm not really into detective fiction and police things and slightly mundane run-of-the-mill dramas. I like things with a bit of imagination, a bit of proper escapist entertainment, and that's reflected in my top 10 films. So if you're looking for the Oscar winners, if you're looking for Nomadland, if you're looking for The Father, I'm sure they're great films, but they're not on my list. Mine just going on that visceral level of films that really sort of got my pulse racing and got my blood pumping through my veins. So without further ado, let's crack on with the first of my top 10 films of the year. Start off, number 10. Number 10 is a recent film, and this again is an example of a film which I didn't see at the cinema. Had a limited cinema release. It's on Netflix. I've done a video already a couple of days ago. It's one of the most recent videos I've done. It's Don't Look Up. Adam McKay's coruscating look at the modern world and how society reacts in the face of potential disaster. I won't go into the film in too much detail because there's a full video on it, but it stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence as two fairly undistinguished astronomers who discover that a very large comet the size of the Himalayas is on a collision course with the Earth and is going to wipe out all life on Earth within 6 months. Obviously, they take this information to the president, who's a little bit on the incompetent side. She's played by Meryl Streep. Her son is one of her advisors. He's played by Jonah Hill. And the film is it reflects what we've been going through in the last 2 years, if you like. It's the story of an incompetent president. We have one of those. It's the story of people's attitude, their disbelief, their denial, their refusal to accept what's right in front of them, conspiracy theories, all that sort of stuff that bedevils the modern world in the pandemic era. It's a great film. It's very witty. It's not a laugh-out-loud comedy, but it has great moments of broad comedy in it. It has some real spectacle in it, but it is a film that makes you think, wow, this is really reflecting the world we're in. This could happen. We've seen how the world has reacted at a time of crisis, and this is how it would undoubtedly react in a time of even more extreme, potentially life-threatening and world-threatening crisis. It's a great film. It's on Netflix now. It's my number 10. My number 9. Funnily enough, this is another one which I didn't see in the cinema. I watched this on a streaming service. I think it came out on streaming fairly quickly. We have a visitor, of course. This is Disney's Cruella. Now, again, this is an unusual choice for me, and this is one which sort of wasn't in my top 10 that I thought, well, I did enjoy it a lot. So I put it back in the top 10, and then it dropped out again, then I put it back in, and I think it deserves to be in the top 10, possibly slightly more than some of the ones which are the breakers, if you like. This stars Emma Stone in what is an origin story of Cruella de Vil from the 100 Dalmatians film. And it's, as I said, an origin story. And Disney are doing this a lot now. They're remaking their animated films. Yes, hello, madam. They're remaking their animated films in what purports to be live action with a lot of computer animation and so on, with mixed results. I think The Jungle Book was quite good. I haven't seen Mulan. I haven't seen the new versions of The Lion King, so I can't say how good or otherwise that they are. But Cruella I really enjoyed because of two things. Emma Stone's very, very good turn as Cruella de Vil, although she isn't Cruella de Vil at this point in the film, of course, and a sensational turn by Dame Emma Thompson, who is just, she really is acting royalty as Cruella's sort of rival in the fashion industry in a very stylized version of London in the 40s or 50s. It is sort of difficult to place where it's supposed to be. But what is so good about this film is the whole style of it. It's so vivacious and so colourful and so extravagant. It's very Disney. It's got some great supporting performances. It's just a very stylish, slick, entertaining film. It's not the sort of film I would normally watch, much less put in my top 10 films of the year. But it's one I'm probably going to watch again quite soon because I've got it on Blu-ray now. As I said, I watched it on streaming service. And I am a big physical media person. Rosie, please behave. Sorry, the cat just will not let me do anything. Rosie, over there. Come on. So yeah, that's Cruella. If you haven't seen it now, check it out on Disney Plus or pick up the Blu-ray, which I think is quite cheap in a lot of places. Now, I picked it up myself for 8 or 9 quid in Asda a few weeks ago, much to my surprise. Well worth having and an excellent film. Number 7 on my list is a film, again, which I watched this week. This is another one. I mean, funny enough, all the 3 first films are ones I didn't see at the cinema. It's Promising Young Woman, directed and written by Emerald Fennell and starring the ever-impressive Carey Mulligan. This is a film which is unusual for me because it's not a big blockbuster film. It's not a big FX-driven film. It's a drama. It's a thriller. It's also slightly a potboiler. This, you may know, is the story of Cassie, played brilliantly by Carey Mulligan. She's got a troubled past. Her friend Nina died. We assume she committed suicide after an incident when she was in college, training to be a doctor. Cassie now, as an adult, she's 30, and in the evenings she dresses up, she goes to nightclubs, she pretends to be drunk, she lets men befriend her and look after her because they think she's in a bit of a state. They inevitably end up taking her back to their place for their own particular purposes, where she turns on them and she doesn't hurt them, but she terrifies them by explaining what she's doing and why she's doing it and how men should not intimidate women in this fashion. It's a sort of a study of what they call toxic masculinity and women as victims. And these are all issues which have come very much to the forefront in the Me Too age, since the whole Me Too thing started, 4 or 5 years ago. And I think they're all very valid points to make. And I think there are certain conversations to be had and issues to be discussed about the relationship between men and women on a social basis and all those sorts of things. And I think that this film does that, but it doesn't do it with any huge subtlety. That's, the point that I would make. It's a great film and it does make those points, but I think it's sort of sledgehammer tactics in a way. It's not subtle. I mean, all the men are depicted as monsters with one thing on their mind, apart from one character. And Cassie, although you understand why she's doing what she's doing, she's quite cruel in some ways, particularly what she does to the dean of the college that she goes to at one point, sort of really torments her because of her lack of action at the time when the original complaint was made in relation to her friend Nina. It's a complicated film. I think that it addresses these issues very well, but I think it's not subtle in the way it does them. And I think it's a shame that these issues, which are important, have been wrapped up in films which are a little bit potboilerish. I'm looking at, there was a film which I reviewed earlier this year, way back at the beginning of the channel, called I Care a Lot, which was basically about the abuse of the elder care system. But that was all wrapped up in a slightly potboilerish thriller storyline. And again, Jordan Peele's films, which are much lauded in the horror community, Get Out and Us, which were these sort of incredible explorations of racism, but they weren't really, because at the core of them were very, very hokey horror cliches. Us particularly was, desperately unsubtle, and I haven't enjoyed either of his films, not on a rewatch basis. So I think the problem that Hollywood and the film industry has to come to terms with is how to address contemporary concerns about society and about the way people engage with one another. But I think it needs to find a way to do it in a way that is a little less extravagant, a little less, not exploitative, that's not the word, with a bit more subtlety, perhaps. There may well be films out there that do that. I mean, I don't watch all the films that come out, obviously, but this was a very high-profile film. Quite rightly, it's beautifully made, beautifully acted. Particular kudos to a chap called Bo Burnham, who I was only aware of through having seen an album in the charts that he'd released. And I didn't actually know he was a man. I assumed he was another soul singer or rapper or something, because every time I look at the charts these days, there's some new rapper I've never heard of. But he's actually a young man. He's in his early 30s. Superb performance, as though the only really genuine, nice guy in the film. So it's a difficult one to wrap your head around. It does deal with issues, and it deals with them in a very stark way. I just wonder if that's the best way to deal with them. That's Promising Young Woman, which comes in at number 8. Number 7, this is a film I saw much earlier in the year. It still hasn't had a proper release in the UK. I think it's on streaming services. And I'm actually awaiting a Blu-ray, which I've ordered from Amazon Germany, because it hasn't been released physically over there. I want a copy of it. It's a film called Greenland. Again, there's a review of this, which I did in the early days of the channel. This is a classic sort of a disaster movie in the style of Deep Impact and Independence Day. And in some way, it has sort of connections to Don't Look Up. It stars Gerard Butler, who normally I'm a bit arm's length with, because he doesn't tend to make great films, and Morena Baccarin, who's Deadpool's girlfriend. You'll know her from Firefly and Homeland. A good solid performer, who's his wife. And basically, it's a similar sort of situation. There's a comet on the way to Earth. It's going to cause mass destruction. Because of his job as an engineer, Gerard Butler's character is one of those who's been selected to be hidden away in a bunker in Greenland. Unfortunately, he gets the call just as the chaos starts, and he gets separated from his family, has to find his way back to them before the world is devastated. It's quite a low-key film. It's quite low budget, but there are some great effect sequences. But the thing about this film is not about the effects. It's about the people. It's about Gerard Butler and his wife and their son, and how they get separated and try to get back together. It's very tense. There's some really exciting, nail-biting sequences in it. And a bit like Don't Look Up, it deals with sort of human nature, how in times of crisis, people's morality and people's sense of self and common sense go out the window. It's a really, really good film. Really enjoyed it. It really struck me when I watched this months back. It's a different sort of film. And like Don't Look Up, it deals with huge apocalyptic ideas, but without just being all bang and Michael Bay type flash. It's about the people and the stories, and I think that's a very good development, these sorts of films. I'm not sure what streaming service. I think it's on Amazon, but as I said, I'm waiting for a Blu-ray to arrive in the new year from Germany, because I just want to have a physical copy of it. Greenland. We'll pitch up at number 6. This might be a controversial one, because it's not been particularly well reviewed. Maybe I just saw it at the right time. And I'm conscious that as I'm recording this, I haven't actually recorded my full review of it, because I only saw it yesterday. It's The King's Man. I absolutely love this film. This just blew me away. This was just what I needed to blow away those post-Christmas cobwebs. And I was sort of reluctant to see it in a way, because I thought, well, I like the first Kingsman. It was a real breath of fresh air as well. The second one was a bit of a letdown. She just went over the top completely. But this was intriguing because Matthew Vaughn, the writer-director, I know there was a lot of criticism about the lariness and laddishness of the first two films. By accident or design, you don't get much of that in this film, because it's set back at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's very much about the origins of the whole King's Man idea, this sort of secret organisation protecting the country against terrible threats. And it stars Ralph Fiennes, who I think has never been better. What a Bond he would have been. What a Bond he would have been. He plays M, of course, in the Bond franchise now, but in this he's the action man. He's great. It stars Rhys Ifans as Rasputin, a character who's the closest that this film comes to those sort of extremes of the first two films. But it's basically the story of how Ralph Fiennes' character, the Duke of Oxford, he's foregone violence or warfare, haven't seen the bloodshed that these things cause, and he's joined the Red Cross, and during the Boer War he goes to a concentration camp with his wife and young son to deliver supplies to some of the prisoners there. During a sniper attack, his wife is killed, and she vows, she asks him with her last breath to protect their son Conrad, to make sure he doesn't get into any trouble. 12 years later, we're on the eve of the First World War. Conrad's now a 17-year-old boy. He wants to enlist, he wants to join the army, he wants to join the war effort, but his father won't let him. The story moves on then that the Duke of Oxford is still involved with security services, and he's employed by Lord Kitchener, played by Charles Dance, to protect the Archduke Ferdinand, against whom there is a rumoured assassin on the loose. Meanwhile, we meet up a sinister Scottish terrorist called the Shepherd, who on a mountain hideaway is tending his goats and sending his agents out across the world to cause chaos and to basically precipitate World War One. I won't go any further into this because I'm going to do a full review. A great film. I just love this. It just completely surprised me because it didn't have the excesses of the earlier films. It was much more character based. It was quite shocking in places, quite heartbreaking in other places as well. Much more attention to detail on characters, some really good dialogue, really nice relationships between the main characters, some great action sequences, but it doesn't go over the top in those sequences the way that perhaps the first, or certainly the second film did. A real surprise. I hope it does better at the box office. It hasn't got off to a great start. I think they released it at the wrong time. It has been sitting on the shelf for 2 years because of the pandemic. It's had, I think, something like 8 release dates pushed back and pushed back. If you're thinking, I don't want to see this, I didn't like the last one, this is so much better. It's a great period action film, and it's sort of set up a sequel, which I hope we get. So do go and see it because it's just a great time. Right, excuse me. Let's move to number 5. My 5th film of the year is Dune, Denis Villeneuve's first half of his adaptation of Frank Herbert's fairly impenetrable sci-fi blockbuster, Dune. I've not seen the David Lynch version, which came out 84-ish, something like that, 85. I'm not a hard sci-fi fan. Again, there's a review of the film further back on my channel. I'm not a massive fan of hard sci-fi. I can sort of take it or leave it. And I knew this was going to be quite a dense, difficult film because I understand it's got a huge raft of characters and situations and locations and things. But I went to see it at the cinema, slightly apprehensive. I thought, is this going to overwhelm me a little bit? I'm a simple soul at heart, but I absolutely loved it. It's a beautifully made film. I mean, you really need to see it on a big, big screen, the widest screen you can, because it's beautifully framed, beautifully put together, fantastic visuals, great performances from the likes of Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson. It's a great cast and a stately science fiction film. It is a proper science fiction film. And it's nice to see some of that. There's fights and there's battles and things in it, but it's more about the relationships with these characters manoeuvring themselves into position to take control of this planet Atreides, where is this vital spice mineral. It's just great. It's a very intelligent science fiction film, and I was just amazed that I appreciated it as much as I did. Looking forward to getting the 4K disc so I can watch it again. A great film. Really, really enjoyed it. And it pitches up at 5. My number 4 film, my number 4 is one which I think's been forgotten a bit, really, because it came out, I'm thinking March, April, something like that. It's A Quiet Place Part 2, directed by, and I think written by John Krasinski, starring John Krasinski, briefly, and Emily Blunt, Cillian Murphy. And it is the sequel to A Quiet Place, which came out, 2-3 years ago. The brilliantly imaginative science fiction film about a world that's been invaded by alien creatures that hunt by sound. So survivors, such as they are, have to exist in a world of virtual silence. The first film was a beautiful study in quiet terror and creeping dread. And when I heard there was going to be a sequel, I was sort of, really? Good as the first one was, where'd you go with it? I was heartened when I heard that John Krasinski was back on board because he had an idea for a sequel. And this really hits the spot. It carries on from the end of the first film, picks up exactly where the first film left off, and tells us what happens to Emily Blunt and her family next when they vacate the farmhouse that burns down, find themselves out in the countryside being hunted, and they pitch up with character played by Cillian Murphy, who's one of their former neighbours or family friends. There's a very nice prequel sequence where we see the actual alien invasion begin. Not great detail of it, but we see it start, and it's terrifying. It's really nail-biting stuff. It's a great film. it keeps up the tension, and it cleverly develops the idea without ruining it and exploiting it, which is what I was worried about, because there's nothing worse than seeing a great one-off and then discovering they've done a sequel which really isn't as good. This is as good as the first one. Sets up a third one. I understand that there is going to be another film set in this universe, which concerns me slightly because I don't want that. I just want to see where the story ends, and a third film could do that nicely. If you haven't seen it for a while, and I haven't seen it for quite a while, it's worth revisiting it. Such a good film, A Quiet Place Part 2. That's my number 4. My number 3 then, the big 3. My number 3 film is the latest and last Bond film starring Daniel Craig. It's No Time to Die. Again, this is quite a controversial one because, although it's done incredibly well, it's taken something like 800 million at the box office worldwide in a pandemic era, and that's pretty good. And it went down very well and had very good reviews, but I know a lot of people who are ardent Bond fans really don't like it. They've taken against it. And there's a review further back on my channel. I'm not going to go into it in depth because I know there's people who possibly still haven't seen it because it's still playing in cinemas, even though it's available on streaming and on physical media, which is quite unusual. But there are people who might not have caught up with it yet. But I think I appreciated it more than perhaps some did, because I did go to the effort of revisiting all Daniel Craig's previous films before I saw it. Well, I'm glad I did, because it does have a lot of connective tissue to those films. There are lots of things set up in the first one that pay off, again, by accidental design in the fifth one. So it helped to sort of see that story arc, that development across those 5 films. And I think if you do that, you get more out of it. It may be that some of the people who didn't like it hadn't revisited those films and just watched it as a thing on its own. And I think you get more out of it if you are well aware of what's happened before, whether you remember it or whether you've seen them all again recently. But I thought it was a very good film. It sort of went back as far as it felt it could to the style of classic Bond, with this sort of slightly larger-than-life villain, his headquarters full of guards, some great action sequences, some great stunts, but with the added extra of all the emotional stuff that comes with Daniel Craig as Bond. You know, he starts off in retirement, having driven into the sunset with Madeline Swan, played by Léa Seydoux, at the end of Spectre, which did close off the story and did close off the Daniel Craig era. But there was obviously more story to tell, and this film tells that story very well. It opens up his story again, brings him back into active service, and introduces him to parts of his past he didn't know he had. Again, I won't say too much more than that for spoiler purposes, but I thought this was terrific. Some great action stuff, Daniel Craig's best performance as Bond, and definitely the right one for him to bow out on, because I think looking back when you see Spectre, it ends fairly satisfactory, but you sort of think, well, what happens to him next? Now we know. Where we go with Bond, of course, that's a whole other issue, because if you've seen the film, you know it ends in a certain way. James Bond will return, I'm not entirely sure how, but I just thought it was a great film, and I had a great time at the cinema with it. The 2 3/4 hours or whatever just flew by. All I can say to the people who didn't like it is that I understand if you felt it betrayed certain things from Bond, but I think it's very hard now to reconcile this Bond with all the others. Whether you come up with your own explanation for Bond, or who Bond is, whether Bond is a code name or whether it's a multi-universe Bond, I don't know. I think it'll just give you a headache if you try to make too much sense out of it. But I just thought, as a film that came out this year, it was great and I enjoyed it. That's No Time to Die. It's my number 3 of the year. My number 2 of the year, excuse the sniffles, Spider-Man, No Way Home. I mean, what a film. Seen it twice now. Again, you'd have seen my non-spoiler review. I have actually filmed a spoiler review, but I haven't put it up yet. I don't know if I will, because a lot of people have done that. And not that I'm slow off the mark with it, but I just thought, do we need another spoiler review? I don't know. What a great film. I mean, this was everything I wanted it to be for Marvel. It's not been the best of years for Marvel in the cinema. And again, I will talk about other Marvel films when I talk about other films of the year which I've seen. But this just knocked it out the park. It gave you everything you wanted. It gave you all those things you'd heard rumoured about. It was just joyous, punch the M. And I saw it, luckily I saw it in the evening of the first night it came out, when the secrets hadn't been revealed yet, and the clapping and cheering and the punching the air stuff was just, it was just great to be with an audience watching a big crowd-pleasing film that people were invested in. I saw it the second time, didn't quite get the same impact. There were ripples of appreciation and things, but not the big wow moments that I had the first time. So I'm glad I went to see it that way first. Um, Probably Marvel's. Oh, I don't know. Is it Marvel's best? It's that or Infinity War, I guess, in terms of the most accomplished and most spectacular film. But it's not to be missed. I mean, the action is fantastic. The finale is fantastic. And it, bit like No Time to Die, it sort of finishes and closes the door on a certain period of the character's life and offers up, you know, all sorts of potential for the future. So that's Spider-Man No Way Home in cinemas now. Incidentally, big kudos to the film because, as I say, we're still in a pandemic era. There's still a lot of people who aren't happy going to the cinema, and this has made 1.2 billion already, and it's only been out 2 weeks. I think it might hit 2 billion. I'm not sure, but it's going gangbusters at the moment, and you can see why. It's great to be in the cinema with a film that people really want to see. So, my film of the year. And again, I suppose, I think this has been a few people's film of the year, so I'm quite pleased to be in unison with at least some critics. It's Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. Again, there's a review way back down the line. I love Edgar Wright's films. You know, I've seen my retro movie review of Shaun of the Dead. No, sorry, not Shaun of the Dead. Why do a retro movie? I'm always watching it. You'll have seen my retro movie review of The World's End recently, which isn't my favourite by any means of the Cornetto. Sorry, I'm just looking at Rosie. She's faffing about with the door. But I absolutely adored Last Night in Soho because it was such a beautiful, rich and vivid film. And I went to see it and I was just snared like that by the story, the look, the visual representation of 1960s. It's a love letter to 1960s London. Almost like a cautionary love letter in a way about the perils of an ingenue who travels to a big city without really understanding what's in store. But it's beautifully told. It's a thriller. It's a horror film. I think in the last act, Edgar Wright's sort of horror leanings are a bit, perhaps too evident. I think it sort of touches on Shaun of the Dead a little bit in some ways. But that's just a very minor criticism. I mean, it's great to see the late Dame Diana Rigg, bowing out with such a terrific performance in a terrific film. It's just a beautiful film and it's just gripping. And it just enraptured me, and I came out of the cinema thinking, well, I just love that film. I'm sure there are flaws in it, and I understand that some people who've seen it have looked back and thought, yeah. But I just think it's a beautiful film. That's my film of the year, Last Night in Soho from Edgar Wright. Now we're going to take a look at some of the other also rans, if you like, the films that nearly made the top 10 but didn't quite hit the spot. Right, let's take a look at some of those films which didn't quite make the cut into the top 10, but are very, very highly recommended films, which certainly jostle for position in the top 10. And looking down at my list, the first of those is Suicide Squad. The Suicide Squad, I should say. This is James Gunn's reinvention of the anti-superhero squad from DC. The first film came out about 4 years ago, was pretty ropey. No one really expected this reboot or sequel. But it was great fun. I mean, it was James Gunn at his most extreme, I suppose. It was full of extreme violence and action, great special effects. Who would have thought a monster appearance by Starro, who appeared in the first ever issue of the Justice League comic in the 60s. It was just a love letter. Again, a love letter, a cinematic love letter to borderline sort of cult comic strip characters. We get Margot Robbie back again as the persistent Harley Quinn, a character I've never particularly warmed to, but a performance I did enjoy here. Idris Elba, Michael Cera, David Dalmatian, and Sylvester Stallone as the voice of the shark. It's just mad. It's a big, mad romp of a film. Massively colourful, just so watchable. You know, don't let the kids watch it, of course. If the kids like Spider-Man and the Hulk, don't let them watch this because it's not meant for them. It wasn't a big box office success. I think it wasn't the sort of film that was going to drag people out to the cinemas. Maybe it came out a bit too early. It came out in the summer. But I thought it was a great film. Very nearly made my top 10. Second up is a film, again, I've reviewed this on the channel a little bit further along. This is an underrated little thriller called The Courier. Stars Benedict Cumberbatch, who seems to be in almost everything, as Greville Wynn, who was an inadvertent spy during the Cold War. And I sort of vaguely knew the name of Greville Wynn. I knew something to do with espionage, but I didn't know his story. This was a really, really good film, though. It's the story of how he gets involved in espionage for MI5, travelling to Germany under the guise of um, Taylor, and ends up bringing secrets back to the British government, which, in many ways, deflect World War III. It's all part of getting evidence of what's going on in Cuba with the Russian missile bases and so on. And because of his work, it went a long way to preventing the World War III, which would, of course, ended everything back in the early 60s. It's a really good taut thriller, low budget sort of thing. It's not a big bang flash film, but it's a film about actors and performances and mood. I didn't want to go and see this. This wasn't on my radar of films to see, but a friend of mine got us together, a few of us together, to go and see this film, and it was a really engrossing thriller. I don't think it's ever going to make my top 10 list of films, but it's certainly worthy of a mention. And go and check out my review further back down the channel. It's available now on Blu-ray and DVD if you want to pick it up. I know it's on sale in the HMV sale at the moment for a tenner for the Blu-ray. It's well worth your time. Here's one that you might have forgotten. Again, there's a review going back months. This came out about March. The Tomorrow War, starring Chris Pratt. Big, loud, ballsy science fiction time travel film with monsters that should have been in the cinema, but of course Amazon snapped it up. And it's a great film. I'd love to see it on the big screen. I'm hoping it will get a physical media release, but I don't know if it will. It's a story of Chris Pratt is enlisted to join the human race from the future, who are fighting against these horrific alien creatures who've invaded Earth. In the future, humanity is being wiped out, and humankind has travelled back to the past, i.e. now, to recruit more soldiers for the fight in the future. It's a doomed and desperate fight. It's a very clever film, very clever conceptually. Some great action scenes, some great special effects and spectacle. It's a bit sort of dumb, I suppose, but there's some nice emotional stuff going on, nice character stuff. It's a real ride of a film. It's been forgotten because it came out a while ago, but I just wanted to give it a mention now as one of my also rans. Another one of my also rans, in fact, I'll mention these both together, very nearly made the top 10, and when I drafted my top 10 originally, they were there, but they dropped out when a couple of others, I remember that one and I remember this one. I'm talking about Marvel's double barrel releases of Black Widow and then Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which came out this year. Black Widow I enjoyed. It was a meat and potatoes Marvel film. As most have commented by now, of course, it should have come out 2 years ago when Black Widow was still a living part of the MCU. It did seem like an afterthought, but it was a good film in and of itself. Of course, it introduced Florence Pugh as Yelena, and Natasha Romanoff's sister. Of course, her place in the MCU is now cemented because of her appearances in the brilliant Hawkeye TV series. So it certainly lays the seeds for all that. I think Black Widow herself, Scarlett Johansson, is sort of slightly edged out a little bit because you've got a big performance by Florence Pugh, got a big performance from David, who plays father, if you like. Oh God, I can't remember his name now. The guy from Stranger Things. Anyway, him, he's great. But they're such big performances. Hers is more mannered and measured, if you like. She plays the Black Widow as we know her. But it's a great film. It's a nice sort of bit of backstory to that character, and there's some good action sequences in it. But it didn't quite make the top 10. Similarly with Shang-Chi. I mean, I love Shang-Chi. Not as much as some did. I do have a problem with films that start off as one thing, then have a massive gear change halfway through and become something else. Well, I really enjoyed the first 40 minutes or so, which was a very contemporary story of this superhero hiding in plain sight in New York, Shang-Chi, who is the son of an immortal warlord who fled his family home when he was asked to become an assassin, and now he's a busboy, basically parking cars for a living. The Ten Rings criminal organisation, who were hinted at way back in Iron Man in 2008. I've never ceased to be astonished by the way Marvel plan out their films. But his father wants to get these two pendants, which Shang-Chi has and his sister has. His sister's back in the East. I love all that stuff. I loved all the early, the big fight scene on the bus is brilliant. When it goes to the fantasy kingdom, after about 40 minutes to an hour, it becomes so different. It's hard to reconcile the two halves. But I love all the fantasy stuff, and it's very well done. But in the end, it does become a huge battle with like flying dragons and beasts and demons and stuff. That's nothing like the Shang-Chi comic strip I used to read in the 70s. This is a complete tonal reinvention of that character, which is not a bad thing. But as a spectacle, it was great fun. Again, I saw it twice in the cinema. I had a good time with it. It just, and again, it was in the top 10 when I started out with this top 10, and then it got edged out. But I wanted to mention it because it's just a great film. I also want to mention Love and Monsters. Now, I can't really remember. No, I think this came out this year because I'm sure I did a video on it. This is a really good film, which is on streaming. It's a sort of post-apocalyptic film again. And it's sort of an homage to the Ray Harryhausen School of Filmmaking with what look like animation monsters. It's basically a comet has come to Earth. This happens a lot in films. And the effects of the radiation from the comet when it's destroyed cause small organic life forms, insects and animals, to become huge. The human race has to go underground. And the film is basically the story of a young lad whose name I can't now remember, unfortunately, because I just thought of the film. He has to travel across the ravaged countryside to be reunited with his girlfriend, who is in another underground colony. On the way, he has to fight off monstrous beasties to find his way back to his former love. It's just a nice, unpretentious special effects monster film, and I really appreciated that. I thought it was great fun. And that's available. I'm not sure what streaming service is on, but you'll find it out there somewhere. Yeah, the final one to mention then is, of course, Godzilla vs. Kong. I have to mention this. This came out early this year, about March or April, really straight to streaming, although I think it had a cinema release as well. I saw it on streaming first, then I went to see it in the cinema. It's a great film, but it's stupid. It's very stupid. I think only the second time. I was so relieved that it wasn't as bad as King of the Monsters that I thought, yeah, this is great. Second time you saw the asses was quite dumb. Huge fun though. I mean, last proper action scenes with Godzilla and Kong fighting in the light, and you can see what's going on. The human stuff is disposable. It doesn't matter what Rebecca Hall and all these other people are doing, because you're just seeing the monsters. But it just gets, the ridiculous business of traveling in these capsules to the hidden Earth at the core. But you're not there for the plot and the story. You're just there to see the monsters fighting, and we got plenty of that. So I love Godzilla and Kong. I've seen it twice now. Whether I won't rush to watch it again. I'll watch it again in the next year or so, I would imagine, for the spectacle of it. But it's a stupid film. But I did enjoy it. So those are my also ran movies. The ones which I really enjoyed but couldn't quite get into the top 10. I'll give a mention to Ghostbusters Afterlife. Again, as a review further back. Again, it's a good film. I enjoyed it, but it's not one I'm desperate to rewatch. I'm not particularly wedded to the Ghostbusters franchise, as I know many people are. It's not an important franchise to me, if you like. But it was a good film. I enjoyed it. But I didn't get that nostalgia kick that I think would have made it more memorable for me if I had. So those are my films of the year, my top 10 and a few honourable mentions. However, in any year, no matter how good the films are, there are always films that aren't so good. So I'm going to mention a handful of films which were stinkers. And there's 3 particularly bad films. 4, in fact, films that I particularly want to single out. I'm going to start off with Monster Hunter, the latest film from Milla Jovovich and her husband, Paul S. Anderson. I think that's her husband. And there's 2 Paul Andersons, but I think it's Paul S. Anderson, who did the up and down Resident Evil franchise. This is the latest based on a computer game, and it's utter rubbish. It's basically Milla Jovovich plays this sort of military officer who's transported to another world where there are giant monsters, and she has to fight them, and she meets up with other people before getting back. And it's just weak. It's just weak. The dialogue is atrocious. The action's okay. It perks up at the end when a certain thing happens, but it was just dull. Very, very disappointing, very poor. I also want to mention Old from M. Night Shyamalan. I was intrigued by the idea of this, about a group of tourists who go to a secluded beach, can't get off it, but they're aging super fast. So, young children who are like 11, 12, suddenly they're 18, and people who are in their 30s are suddenly 40s. It's a good idea. It's based on a graphic novel, but the film is dreadful because the script is terrible. The acting's bizarre. The visuals are more ludicrous and laughable than horrific. It's just a very awkward, clunky, clumsy film. It's a shame because M. Night Shyamalan went through a rough patch, started to perk up with a few slightly better films, but this is sort of back to square one. Dreadful film. It really is so bad it's good, that sort of film. I also want to mention a film which didn't get a cinema release, but again is available to stream, Shadow in the Cloud, starring Chloe Grace Moretz, who was such a promising actress when she was in Kick-Ass all those years ago as a profanity-spewing child, but now she's making weird, bad films. This is a film which had a lot of potential. She plays a mysterious young woman with a package who wants to travel across the Atlantic. I can't remember, so long since I've seen it. On board a plane during World War One, I'm thinking. And again, this is a slightly like promising young woman. It's trying to deal with issues of sexist male attitudes. She's in the hold of this plane, and there's a good 40 minutes, which is just a shot of her in the hold of this plane reacting to what these men are saying. And the stuff that is just crass stereotyping of the way men talk about women. I know men do talk about women in these, unpleasant ways, but this is so clunky and so, men bad, look at these toxic men. And all of a sudden, it sort of shifts a little bit with this strange creature, sort of devil-type creature attacks the plane, appears on the wings, plane crashes, a bit of a... It's just all over the place. But the script is terrible. I say these clunky bits of sexist dialogue from the blokes. This odd decision to have a good half of the film, a one-shot of her in the hold of the plane just talking and looking around. Just weird and dreadful. Terrible film. But it's a masterpiece compared to the number one stinker of the year. One of the stinkers of all time, to be honest. Again, there's a review of it further back down the channel. It's another Melissa McCarthy stinker, and of course, it's Thunder Force or Thunder Farce, as I called it. I'm not going to ennoble it by talking about it for too much because it's awful. It's attempts to be a sort of a parody of superhero films, but it hasn't got the wit for that. She and Octavia Spencer, I don't know what she thinks she was doing in this, become these sort of superhero characters and don't do anything very interesting. The idea of a joke is Melissa McCarthy complaining about the rubber costume she's wearing being a bit stinky because she's a big lady. It's awful. It's just embarrassingly bad, and I'm not surprised it was dumped on a streaming service. I'm just amazed that she's consistently allowed to make these terrible, terrible films. That's Thunder Force. Really dreadful, dreadful. My disappointment of the year, and I hate to have to say this, I was very disappointed by Eternals. Again, you'll have seen the review that I did when I went to see it with Scott. It was a Marvel property I didn't know much about, and possibly I made the mistake of reading the early Jack Kirby comics before I saw the film, and I was disappointed that it wasn't that. And I didn't think it was going to be that, really, because if you've read those comics, the concepts are so huge and outlandish and extreme that you'd never translate that to the screen. But Chloe Zhao, who won the Oscar for Nomadland this year, wanted to make an arty sort of Marvel film, and that doesn't really come off because ultimately Marvel films have to do certain things. So it's trying to be arty whilst having characters flying through the air, shooting laser beams. It betrays the concept of the original comics where you had the Eternals and the humanity and deviants who were sort of an alternative society. But they were a society, they were an intelligent life form. Here they're just beasts who are blasted out of existence. It's just boring. A lot of it is very boring, consisting of lots of scenes of two people standing somewhere very pretty, gazing over the horizon, talking philosophically. There's too many characters. This, as a friend of mine has said, this should have been a mini-series. This should have been a Marvel MCU series where you could have developed the characters a bit more, developed the situation, and perhaps introduced a few more of those original concepts. It just betrays the original material so much, and it's just damn boring. So there we are, kidlings. That's my review of the year, my films of the year. The ones I was disappointed by, and the ones I hated. And ones that I quite liked, but not enough to get into the top 10. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've cut in lots of different bits, so it's going to take a bit of editing, but I'll do it. Let me know what your films of the year were, if you agree or disagree with my comments. Just my opinions of the films I've liked. I know there are lots of better films, I suppose, than a lot of these. But these are the films that I went to see in the cinema. I had a great time with. They're not particularly big, worthy films, but sometimes you just, like I say, I go to the cinema. I want to see a bit of a spectacle. And if it's got a bit of brains to it as well, so much the better. So anyway, it's been a pretty good year, bearing in mind that cinemas have been restricted in terms of the pandemic stuff, and a lot of films have underachieved because of the pandemic, and which is a shame, because a lot of films that deserve to do better haven't done as well as they should. I'm thinking of The Kingsman, particularly the Suicide Squad, that really should have done a lot better, but people are still wary of going to the cinema, which I think is a shame, because certainly in my area, cinema's very safe. You have to have a COVID pass, your seating is all done socially distanced, and I don't think there are any reported cases of anybody picking up COVID from having been in the cinema. So I think they're probably the safest place you can be. Anyway, that's my little look back at the year. Let me know what you think of my choices. Let me know if there's any films that you think that I need to see that I haven't seen. Things that you think I might have forgotten that I should have put in there. And just generally let me know what you think of the year in film. Thanks for watching. It's New Year's Eve as I'm doing this. This probably won't arrive till the 1st or 2nd. So I hope you have a very happy and pleasant and quiet new year. Let's hope that 2022 finally sees us living lives properly again at some point. Until I see you next time then, Happy New Year, and please just remember to keep taking the stuff.